Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive right into the hidden origins of modern pop culture. When we think of rock and roll history, we usually imagine massive stadium tours, glittering LA studios, or the British invasion. But today, we're exploring the secret ecosystem that birthed rock and roll. We're zooming in on the unassuming streets, cramped back rooms, and desegregated safe havens of mid-century New Orleans that actually laid the foundation for the whole shebang.
So where was rock and roll actually born? Before the global domination of this music, you really have to ask yourself, where did that murky piano boogie rumble of this world-changing sound actually come from? There are plenty of cities that loudly claim to be the birthplace of rock and roll, places like Memphis or Chicago. But, as we dig into the historical records, the actual sonic blueprints continually point us down south, specifically to the Crescent City.
To answer that question fully, we have to look to legendary producer, trumpet player, and band leader Dave Bartholomew. He confidently, and honestly, many argue rightfully, laid claim to inventing the foundational sound of a generation, stating simply, "I invented the big beat." And he wasn't just boasting. Bartholomew had the fierce discipline, the vision, and the raw talent to back it up, all during an era of extreme racial segregation and pretty exploitative recording deals.
Section 1. Birth of the Big Beat. Let's step into the streets of post-World War II New Orleans. This was a city deeply rooted in traditional jazz and brass bands, but it was transitioning into an entirely new, electrifying rhythm. Returning soldiers, shifting cultural dynamics, and this huge hunger for something fresh were all colliding to create the perfect, fertile ground for a real musical revolution. Which brings us to jump blues. This was an up-tempo, horn-heavy style of blues that served as a critical precursor to rhythm and blues and rock and roll. By the late 1940s, ebullient artists like Roy Brown were laying the absolute blueprint for this sound right in New Orleans. In fact, Brown's late 40s hit, Good Rockin' Tonight, was so influential it was later covered on Elvis Presley's second single. The tempos were getting faster, the horns were pushing way harder, and the rhythm was just undeniable.
Section 2. The tiny J&M studio. So, where was this musical transition actually being recorded? Well, the beating heart of this new sound wasn't some glamorous, sprawling facility in New York or Chicago. It was actually Cosimo Matassa's cramped J&M recording studio, located at 840 North Rampart Street, literally right in the back of a record shop.
This era was pure magic. Just picture the extreme physical and technological limitations of this place for a second. It's a tiny, sweltering 10 by 12-foot room with cork-covered walls. Matassa was recording on primitive Presto 28N one-take acetate discs. That means absolutely no overdubs. If a horn player sneezed or a guitarist missed a chord, they threw the whole disc away and started over. Yet out of that tiny, cramped box came foundational rock hits that were so massive they eventually made this humble space a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame landmark. Pretty incredible, right?
Section 3. Architects of the Sound. The guys who physically engineered and shaped this music, Cosimo Matassa behind the mixing board and Dave Bartholomew leading the bands, were the true architects of this audio revolution. Together, they formed a symbiotic relationship that completely defined the era.
They basically created a very specific audio recipe. Matassa rarely moved his microphone levels once he had them set for a session, creating what became known as the legendary, transparent Cosimo sound. The secret formula? Well, you take strong drums and lead vocals, mix in heavy bass and guitar, and top it off with light piano and horns. Matassa's whole goal was simple. Just be transparent and don't mess up what the incredible musicians were already doing live in the room. Driving that creative force right alongside Matassa was Bartholomew. His immense musical talent and fierce discipline resulted in a staggering number of songwriting credits over his career. 4,000. Seriously, 4,000 credits. He was out there scouting talent, writing, arranging, and playing, basically serving as the ultimate musical engine for the entire city.
Section 4. The Drop In. Now, these incredible studio musicians needed a place to play live, test their new material on a crowd, and honestly just find a safe place to sleep in the segregated South. That brings us out of the studio and into Frank Peña's legendary Drop In on LaSalle Street.
Nicknamed the Groove Room, Frank Peña's establishment has a fascinating history. It started out simply as a barbershop selling refreshments to workers from the nearby Magnolia housing project. But by 1939, it had evolved into a swanky hotel and nightclub. Peña created an essential safe haven and incubator for talent. It became the absolute social anchor of the New Orleans music scene, hosting visiting giants like Big Joe Turner, Ray Charles, and Dinah Washington, right alongside the local up-and-comers.
But the Dewdrop Inn wasn't just culturally significant, it was politically revolutionary. The venue famously and radically defied the strict segregation laws of the Jim Crow era. As you can see, this all came to a head in a high-stakes 1952 arrest when a white Hollywood actor, Zachary Scott, and his friends were served alongside black patrons. They were actually charged with disturbing the peace. But Pena refused to back down. He filed a suit against the city to challenge the law's constitutionality, a fight that paralleled the broader civil rights struggle until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally forced the repeal of those segregation laws.
Section 5. The Stars Who Rocked. It was precisely within this specific interconnected ecosystem, the meticulous J&M studio by day and the desegregated, vibrant Dewdrop Inn by night, that legendary stars truly exploded onto the national consciousness.
For example, Bartholomew discovered a portly boogie-woogie pianist playing in local bars named Antoine Fats Domino. They took an older song about addiction, reworked it into The Fat Man, and recorded it in 1949 at Matas's studio. The result? It sold an incredible 10,000 copies in just 10 days in New Orleans alone. It eventually sold over 1 million copies nationwide and basically launched the golden age of New Orleans R&B. And the hits just kept coming out of that tiny room. You had out-of-towners flocking to the city, like Little Richard bringing his gospel-derived hollers to record Tutti Frutti. You had local artists like Frankie Ford laying his vocals over Huey Piano Smith's boogie piano riffs and bleeding foghorn effects to create Sea Cruise. And of course, Shirley and Lee defining the era with Let the Good Times Roll. It was an absolutely unprecedented concentration of musical genius.
Section 6. An Enduring Musical Legacy. But as we all know, music is always evolving, right? As the cultural landscape shifted in the mid-1960s and tastes moved toward Motown and the British invasion led by the Beatles, the raw, horn-heavy energy of the 1950s big beat slowly transitioned into an entirely new era. Looking at this timeline, we can easily trace the direct evolution of the city's sound. From post-World War II jump blues in the 1940s, with artists like Roy Brown, it accelerated right into the explosive rock era of the 1950s with Fats Domino and Little Richard. By the 1960s, that foundation seamlessly transitioned into a funkier, more soul-based sound. That era was characterized by the sophisticated pop hooks and brilliant horn arrangements crafted by producers like Alan Toussaint.
Now, what you should take away from all this is that this vibrant, world-changing history didn't just survive on its own. We owe a massive debt to dedicated preservationists, people like jazz record collector Bill Russell, who painstakingly recorded and archived early New Orleans jazz. And of course, Cosimo Matassa, whose meticulous engineering ensured that the raw power of the 1950s big beat was captured permanently on those acetate discs for future generations to study and enjoy.
Which leaves us with a fascinating final thought to ponder. If such confined, unassuming spaces, a 10 by 12-foot room behind a record shop, and a single desegregated nightclub acting as a safe haven could combine to change global music forever, where might the exact same thing be happening right now? The next big cultural revolution is almost certainly brewing in a small, easily overlooked room today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.